sports marketing executive and Stanford-educated mechanical engineer, that's a lot of things, who will discuss the crucial role which ephemera plays in tracing early African-American basketball history. From approximately 1904 to 1950, many all African-American teams emerged in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Cleveland, and other major cities, and became referred to as the Black Fives. In 2014, Black Fives ephemera and other cultural artifacts were exhibited at the New York Historical Society, and the overarching significance of the Black Five era was described as follows. It is as much about the forward progress of black culture as a whole as it is about the history of basketball. This history is relevant today not only as a realization of our collective basketball roots, but also as a search for identity. Mr. Johnson guest curated this important exhibition and has extensive experience marketing many sports brands, including Rollerblade, Prince, Nordica, and as we were just talking about a few minutes ago, shoes and sports marketing, Nike also. So I'm very privileged and proud to give to you Mr. Claude Johnson.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? I have to figure out this machine. Thank you for that really great introduction. While she's doing that, oh, beautiful. Thank you. I would just like to ask how many of you enjoy basketball? Nice, nice, exactly, today of all days. How many of you have a bracket? I'm just curious. A couple, okay. Wow, well, times are changing because Harvard, has been in the NCAAs now for 4 straight years, and they just barely almost beat UNC yesterday, North Carolina, which is Michael Jordan's school. So that says a lot. That's very interesting. My name is Claude Johnson, and I'm the founder and president and executive director of an organization called the Black Fives Foundation. And what I wanted to do is just talk about some of the ephemera that I've collected over the years that our organization has in its archive. And then also I want to leave a certain amount of time at the end for questions, but that's correct. We did have a great exhibition. I say great because it helped to validate this genre in ways that it previously had never gotten attention. So I'm going to, let's see if I can make this work here. Just a tiny bit of sort of housekeeping to explain what this is. It's about African-American basketball teams and the role, not only the role that they played, but the role that ephemera plays in terms of enlightening or illuminating this history and why this history is important. And it's a period that's known as the Black Fives era. And it lasted from 1904, which was around the year that the first African-American basketball teams played. It's when basketball was introduced to African-Americans on a wide-scale basis by a guy named Edwin Henderson in Washington, D.C. And the reason why ephemera is so crucial is that it's virtually the only known artifact or known items to exist in terms of referencing this history. And it's a once forgotten history, but it's also very important in terms of just documenting and tracing this genre. What we try to do is we bring the history back to life, and Ephemera does that in ways that are visible and engaging and relevant. And it also, by the nature of the way that we do it, it leads to inquiries and encouragement from descendants of these teams, which you're about to find out more about, as well as, of course, educators and community leaders, historians, and others. And it also leads to a trusted dialogue and enthusiastic, genuine relations with these individuals, which then leads to more new discoveries. And so, you know, I started this activity when I was working at NBA Properties. I was the director of international licensing in apparel for the league, and this was in the late 90s. And it was right around the time that they were celebrating their 50th anniversary. But and they produced this book called the Nba Encyclopedia of Basketball. It was an 800-page book, but only 3 pages were devoted to earlier African-American basketball teams. But I knew that there was more there because I read a book by Arthur Ashe called A Hard Road to Glory, which was about the journey of the African-American athlete from the 1600s all the way to the present. And in that book, Arthur Ashe, the tennis great, wrote about these teams, about a dozen or so teams that he named, which captivated my imagination, and it made me start looking around for more information on these teams. One of them in particular was called the Smart Set Athletic Club of Brooklyn, and it was organized in 1904, and it was an all-black athletic club that really was a subset of a social club. And I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and I was saying to myself, you know, being in licensing, I could see myself wearing that T-shirt on Flatbush Avenue, Smart Set Athletic Club of Brooklyn, because I'm smart, I'm athletic, I live in Brooklyn, and it makes sense, right? And also I could see that there was something to it. So immediately began doing more research. I found out that nobody knew anything about it. The archivist at the league didn't know anything. The Hall of Fame didn't know anything. And so I started to realize you have to do the research yourself. And tried to figure out how Mr. Ashe had done the research and what was going on with that. And I learned that in order to find out more, you have to go to a library, and that you actually have to go into the basement and look at the microfilm and scroll through it. So I spent the next several years literally in the basement of the Schomburg and in other historical societies, and till my eyes were bleary on weekends, vacation days, some sick days, yes, and just decided, you know, that this was what I wanted to do. And I found out that there were dozens of these teams, dozens of African-American basketball teams. They played from the introduction of the game to the public, to the black public. Because remember, the game was invented in 1891, but blacks didn't really start playing till 1904. And speaking of Harvard, there was a black gym teacher from Washington, D.C., segregated public schools, who took a summer course at Harvard University where he learned the game of basketball, among other things, because he was a physical ed teacher. And he brought it back to D.C., he introduced it to the students, and it immediately was embraced and took off. I want to make a comment that maybe addresses the reason why pedestrianism could have declined, and part of it is that there was this movement called the physical culture movement, which some of you may be aware of, and also within that a concept called muscular Christianity, which created this idea that people who were in the industrial age and who were brain workers had to also go out and use their bodies somehow. And so there were these courses taught by people like Dudley Sargent at Harvard and elsewhere. And Dudley Sargent, one of his students was a guy named Luther Gulick, who was the man that went to the Springfield YMCA and hired this guy from Canada and said, I want you to invent a new game for people in the winter to keep them busy so that they aren't vulnerable to moral decay, because there's nothing else to do. And so he invented the game of basketball. And I think that right around that time, team sports, physical fitness, and those kinds of activities probably began to replace some of the novelty activities that used to be so interesting to people in probably the mid-1800s and beyond. and the Olympic movement, the first Olympics, and so on, right around that time. So these teams were called Black Fives, and our organization, it started out as a company that made jerseys and other things, because at a certain point I began to realize, if this is going to be a really cool t-shirt, I should also trademark or apply for trademarks for the names and logos of all these teams, which I did over the years. And then one day we were sitting around and said, let's make jerseys and apparel and so on. But that only goes so far. And what would happen is that I would get called into schools by teachers, and they would say, can you do a presentation? And I would never want to charge teachers and school children money. So I ended up saying, all right, why don't I just create a foundation? And I donated all of our artifacts, all of the intellectual property, the logos, to this new 501c3. And what we do is we use this history, we preserve it, of course, we exhibit it, we promote it, but we also use it to engage kids and students in classrooms and in the cities, especially in the NBA cities where these teams used to play. So we have an education program with the Brooklyn Nets, we're working with the NBA, we do other exciting partnerships. And we also have this archive that was mentioned that was on display. And why is this genre important? It's because basketball is bigger than ever. Obviously, March Madness is one. The NBA is about to and has actually signed a multi-billion-dollar television deal with ESPN and TNT. But I always ask, and people ask, well, how did we get to this point, though? And I think that this history can teach amazing life lessons: teamwork, sportsmanship, collaboration, inclusion, working toward a vision, innovation, overcoming obstacles, finding common ground, right? Because guess what? Basketball brings all of us together today in a certain way, right? Because I'm here, and that's the only reason I'm here, is because of my work, and you're here because of your interest in ephemera. Now let's see if this actually, here we go. So the game was quite different in the early days. There was a closed basket, which originally was an evolution from the peach basket. The peach basket was nailed to the to the inside of the running track in the old YMCA's, and that's why it's 10 feet off the gym floor. So probably many of us could still dunk if the architect had been different, probably, right? But this closed basket meant that you had to stop play after every field goal. It meant that the referee or someone had to poke the ball out, or eventually they made an evolution so that you could tip it. So this is an ad from an old Spalding catalog. The early days of black basketball were at first strictly amateur, and that meant that there were social clubs, there were churches, and there were community organizations that would create these teams that would compete against one another, first in New York City and then elsewhere. And all of these items that you see here are from our collection. This is a postcard. And by the way, they're also on display, some of them, in the exhibit room, so please feel free afterwards to go check that out. All of these items I found either through descendants or gifts from people that found this, but they weren't interested in it, but they knew that I was. Many of them came from eBay. Sure you're aware of that as a great resource. Some of them came from just finding them in various places where they were available. But what this tells is, from 1915, 1916, that there was a promotional effort going on, and they had uniforms that were identified with the names of the teams. They had equipment. They were began to be formal by then. And you notice that the games are played at a place called the Manhattan Casino at 155th and 8th. If you're a basketball fan, you know that that's also the same address of Rucker Park, where the Rucker Park tournament takes place now. But unfortunately, all that's left of this facility is a parking lot. So one of the things our foundation does is we want to make sure that we create plaques or some other kind of way to memorialize these previous locations. You'll also notice off of, this is an ad from a newspaper, that almost all the ads from those days say basketball, games, and dance. Why? It's because around 1910, around that early part of the century, the phonograph and the radio first became commercially available. And that meant that people who previously had sheet music, that was the only way to listen to music was on your player piano or in your parlor with a piano, they suddenly began to learn about jazz and ragtime and blues, and it created a ballroom construction craze. There were so many people interested in dancing that the only way to go, and this music, that the only way to hear it was to listen to a live orchestra. And so what enterprising African-American promoters would do is they would say, well, look, you're going to be empty on certain nights. On those nights when you're not doing your main gig, can we come in and play basketball? And then, by the way, let's also have an orchestra that plays before and during halftime and after the game. And that was important because right around that time, and even previously in post-Reconstruction era, many African Americans were coming from the South and migrating to northern cities, and they were, for the most part, rural, some oftentimes undereducated, and they were coming into the big city and they were bewildered, and they didn't know how to make sense of it all. And so one good way to do that was to come to a social event, because that might be the first time that you would meet somebody else that's from your home state or from a place that you want to learn more about. So it was really the first social networking that took place at these kinds of events. And that's why all of the ads are basketball, games, and dance, but it was more than just that. It was really a meaningful social opportunity. You also notice that some of these teams, this is a team from Pittsburgh called the Monticello Athletic Association. By the way, I'm going to go back to the Alpha Physical Culture Club. Remember I mentioned that physical culture movement. That was extremely important in the black community because the mortality rate from things like pneumonia, tuberculosis was something like 25%. It means that 1 out of every 4 people were dying, and that's because, remember, it was overcrowded, it was congested. Sometimes people had to get rooms that were below grade, literally below street level, with no windows, that kind of thing. So that was important, and it was thought that physical fitness would help solve problems like pneumonia, tuberculosis, and so on. This was the Monticello Athletic Association, and it's a photograph on the left, but on the right there's a postcard, and you can see that they also had rooters, and they had their own fan sections, and they would travel around and they would compete and play against other major teams. The man who's sitting on the second from your left is a man named Cumberland Posey Jr., and he's actually in the Baseball Hall of Fame because he eventually became the owner of the Homestead Grays. This team was in Pittsburgh, but he was from Homestead, and he eventually took over that team and promoted it and was an architect of the Negro National League. And so a few years ago, they inducted him as a contributor into the Baseball Hall of Fame. He was also one of the greatest players of his time in basketball, so one of the things that we do as a foundation is advocate for the pioneers like these, and we believe that he deserves recognition in the Basketball Hall of Fame as well. So he would be the first, we believe, that would be in both Halls of Fame for a sport. I mentioned the Manhattan Casino, and all those years that I was looking around and searching, I couldn't find any interior photograph. I went to the Bureau of Buildings, and the WPA took photographs of most of the buildings in New York at a certain point in time in the 30s, but I could never find an interior until one day on eBay there was this booklet, which is actually the annual book of this German gun club. But for whatever reason, they had an advertisement for the Manhattan Casino which showed this magnificent ballroom. It had balconies on top. It had a ballroom. It had a beer garden, and it was quite amazing. And what they did is all these famous politicians and activists and others. I mean, I'm talking about Teddy Roosevelt and others would give speeches here because it happened to be in Harlem, but Harlem back then was predominantly German, Jewish, Polish. And so right around 1910 was just about when blacks first started moving up to Harlem. So the owners of the Manhattan Casino, which was catty corner from the Polo Grounds, saw that because the Giants were winning at the time, more and more people were coming up. and it was also right at the terminus of the 9th Avenue elevated train, and so thousands of people would come, so they built this ballroom there, and then they had a great relationship with the African-American promoters, and they said, yeah, you can use our facility anytime, and so that's how, in a certain way, I mean, people don't often think of it this way, but that's how Harlem became the mecca, in a way, of black basketball at the time. Visiting teams would sometimes come to play in New York. So 2 teams from other cities would come to New York to play at this venue because it seated 6,000 people. And this was in 1910. Here's an event that was an advertisement that tells a lot. First, basketball was 2 words in those days. And this also shows that there was no governing body. The previous speaker talked about that in terms of pedestrianism, but there was no governing body for basketball, so a college could play an athletic club. They both happened to be amateur. The St. Christopher Club was sponsored by the St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church in Harlem, which was one of the premier and predominant African-American congregations in the country. And also, notice how it's promoted. Valuable basketball souvenirs will be given to box holders. Well, in fact, this was 1914, and I happened to find one of these items, which actually I think qualifies as ephemera, even though it's an object, but it was printed and used promotionally for this reason by that same promoter the following year. They still had that same rivalry, the Howard versus St. Christopher. And this was actually made by a famous silversmith or printer, a metal printer called Degas and Kloost. And some of you may be familiar with them, but they also produced the gold and silver and bronze medals for the 1904 Olympics, and they also produced the medal for the most valuable player in Major League Baseball for many years. So this is quite an amazing object that was part of our exhibition at the New York Historical. This is a ticket stub, or ticket actually, that's intact, and it was on St. Patrick's Day, which was a few days ago. And again, basketball is spelled with 2 words. This was the Loendi Club, which was one of the premier, probably the most exclusive African-American social club at the time. It was in Pittsburgh. And they were playing the Majestics, which is an all-white team. And this was common for black and white teams to play each other. They were actually playing each other just routinely. It wasn't even a big deal, even before 1910. So there was a lot of collaboration that took place. There were a lot of handshakes, a lot of finding common ground during these days. It wasn't, and this is one of my great discoveries really, or learnings from this, is it wasn't completely, literally as black and white as we might normally have thought, previously. There were a lot of gray areas in there as well. This is very interesting because it was played at the Union Labor Temple, which no longer exists. It's pretty much where the Pittsburgh Civic Arena is now, where the Penguins play. But also, the referee is a man named Chris Heeswoud, who was a Surinamese descent, and it promotes him as being the famous colored referee from New York City. Now, why was that so interesting? It's because he was, in 1920, first of all, he was extremely well known, but in 1920, he became the first officially sanctioned African-American referee by the AAU. Previously, the AAU did not approve or certify African-American refs. And so it took till 1920 for that to finally happen. And it was such an amazing thing that it was actually promoted on the ticket itself. Here's a cover of the Crisis magazine. It's rare to find Crisis magazines, but this was the magazine of the NAACP, the official outreach arm of the NAACP. On the cover of this particular issue, this is skipping ahead a little bit to 1941, is a man named Dolly King, who played for the Long Island University team, varsity. He was the captain and leading scorer, and in 1941, and again, this is relevant because of March Madness, they didn't actually have an NCAA tournament yet. They had NIT. In 1941, LIU was undefeated, but he left the team mid-season. Why? One reason is that he knew he wasn't going to get drafted into a professional league because pro leagues were still racially segregated. There was no pro league that would hire black players back then. But another reason was that he left to join the New York Rens. Of all those amateur teams that started in the 1910s, eventually there were so many people that would come to these events, and they were paying ticket fees, that there was a gate receipt issue. In other words, there was pretty good revenue. It became lucrative. The players and coaches began to say, wait a minute, maybe we would like to get a cut of that. So in the mid-1910s, there was a period of time when the game evolved into semi-pro. In other words, you could get paid to play even though it was frowned upon by basketball's highest authorities. And eventually, though, it became okay when this man, Bob Douglas, decided that he was going to issue full-year guaranteed exclusive player contracts to players. So previously to this, any player could play for any team and get a share of the gate receipts, and that was causing player jumping, what they called player jumping. So at this point, it really meant that the only place you could go if you were amazing black talent was to the New York Rens. There was also a team called the Harlem Globetrotters that was playing at that time as well, and they were very competitive, just like the Rens. But there was a man, a Jewish store owner in Cleveland, Max Rosenblum, who owned a shop called Rosenblum's, and every year he had this tournament with a pretty big purse, relatively speaking, and he invited the Philadelphia Svaz, which was the South Philadelphia Hebrew Association, Jewish team, the original Celtics, which was an Italian team, and the Detroit Eagles, which was a working-class car industry Detroit team, and the Rens, which was a black team. So, I mean, there was a lot going on here. It was a lot of, again, finding common ground. And you'll notice that Dolly King was the leading scorer for the Rens in this particular series of games. They ended up winning this tournament, and but what's interesting is, you know, he got a certain amount of the purse, and that was more money than he could have made. So he left LIU. LIU went on to win the NIT after all, but meanwhile, after this, he kept going, and in Chicago, they had this event that started in 1939 called the World Championship of Professional Basketball, and that was an even bigger purse, and it was initiated and funded by the Chicago Herald-American. And the reason they did that was because everybody that was touring around and barnstorming would claim that they were champions, national champions. And there were so many people teams claiming they were national champs, that they said, let's settle this once and for all with this world championship. And in 1939, this inaugural world championship was, again, this is 10 years before the NBA was formed, was won by the New York Rens, this all-black team. These are some ticket stubs from some of the games that the Rens played, and some of them are from the World Championship. But you'll notice this one at the top right, which is very interesting to me. It's, again, 4 teams, again, the Philadelphia Svaz, and sometimes these teams would travel around together because they were such a draw. In the remote towns of Wisconsin or Illinois or wherever they went, they were welcomed into those towns because they were a mobile economy. Not only did people want excellent basketball, but they also wanted and were interested in the novelty of having an all-black team or an all-Jewish team. There was a team called the Olsen's Terrible Swedes, which was an all-Swedish team. You know, so that was how you branded yourself, this was the kind of team. There was a team called the House of David, which was in name but also in branding a Jewish team, and they all wore full beards, and they played on the court. So people loved that kind of thing, and it was during the Depression, and patrons from miles around would come to town and spend money with stores and the bars, and they would have a bookie or somebody that would take bets. One of the things that happened as a result of this is that if you were on your way from New York City out to Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and stopped in, let's say, Troy or in Illinois someplace, you would also want to have a return game in that same spot on your way back home. But if you destroyed that team so badly on your way out, you might not be welcome into town on the way back. As long as you were within what's called the line, right, the betting line. So you could still win, but probably maybe you don't want to ruin everybody's betting chances if you're, if the over and under is 5 points or whatever it is. I'm not a betting expert, but some of you probably understand that that was why the motion offense and moving the ball around and dribbling and keeping it away from the opponent, because there was no shot clock. That's how that evolved. It's because you didn't want to win by 50 points, even though you could, but you didn't want your other opponent to win, so you just slow down and move the ball around. And so there was a premium on motion and moving without the ball and passing. The reason why I mentioned that ticket stub on the top right is you can kind of see a watermark of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and this is a fundraiser because it was his birthday, but also for the Infantile Paralysis Fund, which predates the March of Dimes, if you're familiar with that. And these teams, they played everywhere. One of the things I found during the acquisition journeys that I would take is that people had scrapbooks. So this, I mentioned Oshkosh, this is a scrapbook, thick scrapbook that somebody kept that was a devoted fan of the Oshkosh All-Stars, which was an all-white team that won. They were actually a member in the National Basketball League. They won this tournament a couple of times. And, but backing up a second, one would imagine that if this was a devoted fan of the Oshkosh All-Stars, they were probably Caucasian. You could guess that. And so that was my assumption. But yet, in the middle of this, and all throughout, actually, this album, there were lots of clippings of the Wrens. And what's fascinating is that people really had a tremendous amount of respect and honored this team. And so you can see by the way that they were described, it wasn't disparaging at all. I mean, they used certain dated words like colored, but you can see how even when the Renaissance Five walloped the local team, hey, that was still news. That was still quite interesting. They won the World Championship in 1939. Here are some of the related ephemera from those tournaments. These are all on display. Each year they had a yearbook, and so we have actually the full collection of all the yearbooks from 1939 till its demise in 1948. Here's a couple of examples where even though they won the World Championship, they were actually still always called colored world champions. You had to signal ahead to that town that you were an all-black team, right? Because you don't want to show up and then there's surprises. You want to let people know. So this business model that they used was copied by others, and they would use names like the Zulu Kings or the Hottentots, and names that would indicate that somehow there was this exotic nature, which meant they must be a colored team, a Negro team, a black team. But at the same time, again, there's evidence that there was a tremendous amount of collaboration. Captains would always shake hands at center court before games. They would do a photo op. This is a team from Whiting, Illinois, the Whiting Five. They played the New York Wrens. New York Wrens were eventually inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. We've advocated for a number of these pioneers to also go in. And actually this year, during All-Star break, they elected John Isaacs into the hall. He's the man that's to the right of the guy with the Whiting jacket. He was elected this year after many years of advocating. There's a number of other players as well. There's posters and placards that exist out there. There is, again, this was a business that was being run, so they had their own letterhead, and they promoted the ballroom itself. The reason why the team was named the Renaissance is because due to the lack of facilities, the owner of the Renaissance team went to the owner, he wasn't called the Renaissance, but he went to the owner of the ballroom and said, if you let us play here as a home court, I'll rename my team. So that's how they became known as the Renaissance, or short, the Wrens. We've been able to uncover player contracts. There's one actually on display out there in the exhibit area. And there were other letters back and forth. What's interesting about this is Fats Jenkins, Clarence Jenkins, who used to play with the Wrens and now he started his own team called the Chicago Crusaders, he didn't even know who the person was to write to in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He just blindly, and even the envelope says, manager of independent basketball team, La Crosse, Wisconsin. But why not? If you hear back from the guy and he says, yes, we're interested, you got yourself a game, and you're getting some money to boot. Some of the very interesting other ephemera, which is photography that shows the culture of who were the fans that were going to these games. On the left, you'll see that that's a photo album, a page that fell out of a photo album, very fragile, but I was able to still display it. And these are the kinds of photos that you might find from those kinds of documentations, right? Because these were the people who went to the games. These were the fans. These were the young fans that grew up with idols, in the game, and it tells a different story from what we always usually hear about, which is fire hoses and back of the bus, and that all was true, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that all African Americans lived in this oppressed life, right? We had tremendous success and our own culture and our own pathway towards aspiration. Teams would travel around. Here's an old photograph that's from one of these albums. Girls were involved as well, all the way back to the 1910s. And so again, just in terms of our slogan, which is Make History Now, we have murals at the Barclays Center that are installed permanently. We had that exhibition. We have about 35 NBA players that have done television vignettes where they talk about this history. There's a bunch of media coverage. We have an apparel opportunity with different licensees. Here are some of the logos that I mentioned. I won't go into depth with that, but this is some of the product that comes from those logos. Even we had a licensing arrangement with Nike. And what's interesting is I use these artifacts when I go out to speak to students. When I hold those up, everybody in the room goes, "Oh, where'd you get those?" And they think that I'm famous somehow, right? And that's when we can start talking about the wisdom and the lessons and the teamwork and so on. We even got a proclamation from the mayor of the city of New York that declared February 10th as Black Fives Day. That was when those murals were unveiled at the Barclays Center. And that's really it. One other quick thing I want to show you. I have the proclamation here, but I also want to show you that these are the kinds of pennants and things that we are producing today. And I guess they, in a certain way, count as ephemera because it's something that's temporary and it's marking a certain period of time and it's celebrating these teams. And then we have, this proclamation itself, the live proclamation, which was just an honor to receive. It mentions me, of course, it mentions our foundation, but mostly it also mentions the history of these teams specifically. So real honor, and it's an honor to have been here speaking with you, esteemed audience. I really appreciate your attention. Thank you very much. Yes?
Is there one black basketball player who would be comparable to a Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in professional basketball?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Jackie Robinson because he was actually a better basketball player than baseball, and he played on one of these teams, the Los Angeles Red Devils. And that team was amazing because they beat the Wrens and other teams. They beat the Chicago Gears with George Mikan and so on. But what happened with basketball was interesting. They didn't really have a breakthrough like that because there was no other league. Negro Leagues baseball coexisted for decades with the black team, with the major leagues. So in this case, there was no league until 1949. And so in 1949, they founded the NBA. It was a merger of the Basketball Association of America and the National Basketball League. And it took one more year before they hired their first 3 black players. And so Those, in a way, were the Jackie Robinsons of the sport. Sweetwater Clifton, who played for the Knicks, Earl Lloyd, who played for what was known at that time the Washington Capitals, and Chuck Cooper, who was drafted by the Celtics. Yes?
How did you establish criteria for inclusion or advocating for inclusion in the Hall of Fame for teams that, who saw them, and how would you even know how good they were?
Well, the reason we know how good they were and how good they are is that they won these world championships, which were, so for example, in 1939, that was an invitation only, so they invited the 12 best pro teams. 10 of those teams were white teams, and they were the best teams that our history can show. They predated and actually are the ancestors of NBA teams, Sheboygan Redskins and Fort Wayne Pistons and so on. And they dominated those tournaments. So that's one way we know. And the other way that we know is that even in the early days of the Hall of Fame, they did recognize some of their talent and some of their amazing experiences. For example, the 1932-33 Wrens team won 88 straight games in 86 days. And that entire team was inducted into the Hall of Fame, and then the owner of the team and a couple of others. So the criteria is, you know, what contribution did you make? Were you dominant? What's great about John Isaacs, the latest one to go in, and the Hall of Fame consulted me on this, and this is one of the reasons why it's so great. If you have a topic that you think is worthy to expand it further, they consulted me and said, what should we do with some of these early guys? And I said, well, you should create a committee like Cooperstown did. And sure enough, that's what they did. They created a special early Pioneers of African American Basketball Committee, which directly elected, now this is the third one, into the Hall of Fame. So what's interesting about John Isaacs is that he was a point guard, and some of the things that he did, they didn't keep stats of that. Steals, rebounds, assists, forced turnovers, blocked shots. And that was his game. He was the gritty, feisty leader on the court. And so that's a really good thing, because it means that even more of these earlier pioneers will potentially be able to go in. Yes, sir?
Where is the archives housed?
In Westies. Westies is a storage facility, and it's, you know, climate controlled and temperature controlled and moisture controlled, and it's just off-site at a, we don't have a building or an office. My office is in our home. I'm sort of like a one-man show. We have volunteers now, we have an admin. But what's interesting is we're talking to the NBA Players Association and others about potentially using their office space and just growing from there. We got our 501c3 last year, and so we haven't even actually applied for grants yet. You know, I've been at this now, like I said, since 1996. It's been a labor of love, but now it's also an effort to make a difference in communities where that really matters. Thank you. Yes? That's right. Exactly. Well, what's so interesting about that is it's actually the other way around. Yes. The Renaissance Ballroom at West 138th and 7th was built in 1922. That was before this period was known as the Harlem Renaissance. It was actually during the time of Langston Hughes and others during that period. It was known as the New Negro Movement. It was reclaiming our identity and saying, hey, we have great art, great culture, great music as well. We don't have to copy the Victorian value system. We can do it our own way. And that was that flourishing that took place in the 1920s. But it wasn't called the Renaissance until much later. Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you very, very much.